Hey everybody, I'm here with Alan Gannett. Oh, wait, I said that wrong, right?
It's Gannett like planet.
Gannett like planet. So here with Alan Gannett, author of Creative Curve. And Alan, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my background has always been around sort of the intersection of, I'd say, like patterns and creativity. So I ran for a long time a marketing analytics company that helped a lot of big companies figure out like what are the patterns in their data around what their consumers care about, what stories are resonating, what messages work. And then I wrote a book that came out a couple years ago that was the result of me getting really interested in this question of are there patterns behind creativity, right? And are there patterns that we can learn? And the book morphed into this sort of like 3-year nights and weekends research project, which is really looking at this question of can we learn to be more creative? And the answer I found is yes. And I talk about the science behind creativity, the practice of creativity. I interviewed about 25 of the world's leading creatives, from like Oscar winners to Tony Award winners to billionaires and Michelin star chefs, looking at what are their practices and what are the things that we can learn from that. And then other fun facts, I live in DC. I'm about to move to New York, and I have a very silly corgi named Maven.
All right, well, very good. Hopefully you all are holding up well with the
Yeah,
quarantine.
we're good. The dog really likes the whole like being home all the time
I bet, I'm sure.
thing.
I know my dogs love it as well. So real quick, why does creativity even matter, especially in this digital era? What's the importance of it?
So what I think is interesting is if you look at sort of how we've designed our society going back the last 50 years, it's all been around training people into doing sort of like high skill but repeatable jobs. So think about like accounting, I think is like a great example where it's like high paying, high skill, but very repeatable. And what we're seeing now is there's this new industrial revolution happening, which is AI and machine learning. And we're automating all sorts of things that we never thought we could actually automate. And if you look at going forward, what are the skills that are actually going to be the most future proof? Creativity is number one. Creativity is the thing that AI will take the longest to replicate, be the hardest for it to do. And so what you're seeing is that inside organizations, what's happening is as software and technology is doing more and more of the sort of productive stack, so to speak, people are now getting to work on higher value problems and problems that demand creativity. So I think creativity is more important than ever because ultimately it's how we protect our careers and how we build our businesses.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, even as like a company like, the one we work at, it's automation is just coming in, but that automation is actually freeing you up to be more human. So to lean into things like creativity. So I agree, it's an important thing. I've got to ask you right now with everything going on, how do you stay creative when you're working from home or on your own?
Yeah, so I think of creativity as like actually sort of two sides. I think of inputs and outputs. So I think a lot of times when we talk about creativity, we sort of obsess on the outputs, like having practices for writing 1,000 words a day or sort of all this stuff. And I actually think you have to talk evenly about inputs and outputs. So by inputs, what I mean is that all of the research we know about creativity says that our right hemisphere is actually very good at being creative. Like, and it's not just certain people, but all of us. But one of the things that distinguishes successful creatives from non-successful creatives is that successful creatives spend a huge amount of time consuming information in their niche. So this is like jazz musicians will obsessively listen to like every single jazz record. Great screenwriters will read screenplay after screenplay after screenplay. And consumption is hugely important because those raw ingredients are what your right hemisphere actually needs in order to work and come up with new and interesting ideas. So that's one thing, inputs. And the outputs, and with the inputs, by the way, I think this is a time where in many ways it's actually very easy, right? You can carve out time, you don't have a commute, you can spend that time reading, consuming information, consuming stuff in your vertical. On the outputs, I think is actually very hard right now. So outputs is the actual sort of craft and actually doing it. And right now we're in an age where there's like so much distraction, right? There's the stress of the news, people's kids are home more, family members are sick and you take care of them. And so I think with outputs, the thing that's really important right now is to build a habit, right? And the habit can be different for different people. Like I'm not a big believer in sort of like one size fits all advice. Like for me, I know that I can write about 3 hours a day max. If I try and write more than that, it doesn't work. And my best writing time is sort of like 8:30 to 11-ish. And so like, that's all. Like I don't try and write more than that. But I then design my life, we're having this meeting, we're having this call in the afternoon. Like I sort of design my life around that in order to actually have that time and to enable that creativity. So I think when it comes to outputs, the important thing is look at yourself, be self-aware, right? When are the times that I'm most creative, most productively creative? And build your schedule around that to the best of your ability. And like one of the things I find that works really well, even at a time like this, is walks, right? Assuming you can walk somewhere that's socially distant and safe, it's like walks are really helpful because they're a time when your left hemisphere, which is sort of our logical brain, sort of like if you're just not listening to music, if you're just walking and like letting your mind be clear, your left hemisphere sort of calms down and there's less interruptions, right? The kids aren't running around, all that stuff. So you can sort of hear the ideas that have been percolating in your right hemisphere, and you can start to experience those sort of like aha moments that we talk about happening. And so I think there's a lot of things, but it all comes down to self-awareness and then being intentional about your time.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because it could be, working from home potentially could be helpful if you can reorganize your work to be at those optimal creative times. Maybe it's in the morning, afternoon, maybe it's at night. And, being home allows you that freedom to really tap into that creativity. So
Totally.
yeah, cool. All right, I've got one more question for you to settle the great debate. Is it better, in your opinion, is it better to take 10 great shots on goal or to take 100 good shots on goal? And why would you say you believe what you do?
So I like that you phrased it as 10 versus 100, not 1 versus 10, because if you ask me, do I think it's one amazing idea, 10 great, or 100 good? I would say it's 10 great. And the reason why is that I think that a lot of times in our culture, we sort of mistaken creativity for just pure productivity and output. Throw a bunch of stuff against the wall, hope something works. The reality is when you actually look at the best creators, they're very good about sort of like honing in on what are the ideas that are best going to resonate with their audience. And even though they know not every idea will work, they use various processes. Like one of the things I was always surprised by is when you talk to really successful creatives is they're very feedback driven.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because they know that their job ultimately is to create something for an audience. So you want to get the audience involved in your creative process. So if you're doing that properly, you should have a natural curation of your ideas where your ideas are sort of roughly in the ballpark. Some of them just won't work for whatever reason, but roughly in the ballpark of good, right? And I think that's a sign of a successful creative process is when you're able to create to how you phrase it, your 10 great ideas, and let's say 7 out of 10 work, versus doing 100 good ideas and maybe 10 out of 100 work, but you wasted tons of time getting there.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And I also love what you just said there about being open to feedback because you're creating for the audience. I know sometimes myself, when I get in that creative mode, I'm afraid of the feedback and I don't want to hear the criticism, but I think that's such a great way to look at it, that you're creating for an audience. You should be seeking that feedback so you can get better.
Well, and I think the way I like to think about it is the mindset shift you want to make in order to make feedback less scary is that just in the way that if I think about writing, right? Just in the way that like editing is part of the writing process, copy editing is part of the writing process. Think about feedback as just part of the process. It's not an assessment of whether or not you're good or bad. If you look at the best writers of all time, very few fall in this category of like, they would go off in a cabin in the woods and write something and then be done with it. Like vast majority of really famous writers, like toil over their work, ask people for notes, iterate to get there. And I think when you realize that feedback is just part of the process, it actually becomes the lifeblood where it allows you to know, okay, I'm on the right track or the wrong track and start to adjust. And over time, what you find is that feedback isn't scary, but feedback's empowering because it allows you to get to that place you want to go.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And you have definitely just changed my mind, honestly, about feedback.
Great.
So, I love getting the feedback. And it's weird because I'll even categorize it as like, I love getting feedback about how I am as a manager on the team or a team leader, but I hate like when I put an idea out there and someone shoots it down. So it's weird. I don't know why.
Yeah, we all like feedback about things we know we're very good at, right? And that's the easy type of feedback.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's really all the questions I had. I'm going to throw one more out to you.
Okay, hit me.
Is Eminem the modern day Shakespeare?
Is Eminem modern day Shakespeare? No, I don't think so. I think of like if I think about who in like hundreds of years people are going to remember from this era, I tend to think it's actually going to be more. I think we tend to we tend to think of sort of pop successes as not creatively particularly inspiring. But I actually think it's someone who's more famous than Eminem. I tend to think it's JK Rowling who will be sort of one of the figures that in history books we're still talking about, just because we're going to have 7 books read by billions of kids and theme parks and stuff for
Yeah.
years and years and years. So I tend to think she's actually probably high on that list of people who would be remembered.
Yeah, she'll be influencing kids in the way they think creatively for the next generation, and then
100%,
yeah,
100%.
makes sense. Well, thank you so much for your time and for answering a few questions, and always appreciate chatting with you. So thank you.
Thanks, man.
Yep.